There's a pattern in the world that most people never notice. Not because it's hidden, but because they're too distracted to see it. It doesn't appear clearly on the news, and it definitely doesn't show up on your phone at the exact moment it begins. By the time it reaches you, it's already old information. The truth is simple, but uncomfortable. Money moves first, and only after that do the headlines catch up. If you pay close attention to history, you'll start to realize that major global events rarely surprise the people at the top. They might shock the public, they might dominate conversations, but for those who operate in positions of power, these events are often anticipated, studied, and in some cases, quietly prepared for. This is not about conspiracy theories or secret meetings in dark rooms. It's about awareness, positioning, and understanding how the world actually functions behind the scenes. Before we even get into specific names or situations, you need to understand why certain individuals always seem to be ahead of the curve. It's not because they are necessarily smarter than everyone else, and it's definitely not because they are lucky over and over again. It's because they are operating with a completely different perspective. They pay attention to signals that most people ignore. They think in terms of probability instead of certainty. And most importantly, they are willing to act before things become obvious. When tensions begin to rise between countries, when political pressure starts building, when resources and influence are at stake, there are always early indicators. These indicators don't scream for attention, but they are there for anyone willing to look closely. Markets begin to shift subtly. Certain industries start receiving quiet attention. Capital begins to flow in specific directions, not randomly, but with intention. This is where the real game begins. I'll talk about Barron Trump in a moment, but first you need to understand the environment that shapes decisions like the ones we're discussing. People who grow up around power, wealth, and high-level decision-making are exposed to a completely different way of thinking. They are not just reacting to events. They are constantly analyzing potential outcomes. They are surrounded by conversations about risk, timing, leverage, and opportunity from a very young age. Now bring into the picture Donald Trump, a figure who, regardless of how people feel about him, has spent decades operating in business, negotiation, and global influence. Whether you admire him or think he's a complete joke, you cannot deny that he understands how to play the game of timing and positioning. And when someone grows up in that kind of environment, it would be naive to assume they are completely unaware of how money moves in response to world events. People online love to laugh, to mock, to dismiss. They look at someone like Barron and reduce him to a stereotype, like he's just some random kid with no awareness of what's going on. But that kind of thinking is exactly why most people stay behind. While they're busy making jokes and throwing around labels, others are paying attention, learning, and positioning themselves for what might come next. Now let's address the part that makes people uncomfortable. The idea of investing around events like conflict or war doesn't sit well with many people, and that's understandable. No one likes to think about serious global issues being connected to financial gain. It feels wrong on the surface, it feels cold. But the reality is that markets do not operate based on feelings. They operate based on reactions to events, regardless of whether those events are positive or negative. When conflict becomes more likely, certain sectors almost always respond. Energy becomes more valuable because supply is threatened. Oil prices begin to rise because uncertainty increases. Defense-related industries gain attention because governments begin allocating more resources. This is not speculation in the emotional sense. It is pattern recognition based on history. These movements have happened repeatedly, across different regions and different time periods. So the real question is not whether these opportunities exist, because they clearly do. The real question is how you choose to respond to them. Most people will see the news, react emotionally, talk about it, and move on. They will watch prices increase and say, "I wish I had known earlier." But they will not change their behavior the next time something similar begins to unfold. They stay stuck in reaction mode. Meanwhile, someone else observes the same situation from a different angle. They recognize the early signs. They understand the possible outcomes. And they make a calculated decision, not based on emotion, but based on probability. They don't need certainty. They only need enough evidence to believe that the odds are in their favor. This is where a lot of people get confused and start judging the situation incorrectly. They assume that taking advantage of these movements means supporting the events themselves. But those are two completely different things. The world will continue to move in its own direction, regardless of what any individual investor decides to do. Choosing to understand and respond to market behavior does not mean you are causing or encouraging global events. It means you are refusing to stay blind to how those events impact the financial system. At some point, you have to decide whether you want to remain purely reactive or become someone who thinks ahead. Because the difference between those two mindsets is massive over time. One keeps you stuck, always late, always chasing. The other puts you in a position where you are at least aware of what might happen next, and ready to act when the opportunity presents itself. The uncomfortable truth is that money does not wait for moral clarity. It does not pause until everyone agrees on what is right or wrong. It flows where it flows, responding to pressure, uncertainty, and change. And the people who understand this are not necessarily better people, but they are often in a better position financially, because they are willing to face reality as it is, not as they wish it to be. So instead of focusing on personalities, instead of getting caught up in whether you like or dislike certain individuals, it becomes far more valuable to study the patterns behind their actions. Look at timing, look at sectors, look at how markets behave under stress. Because once you start seeing these connections, you begin to realize that what looks random to most people is actually quite predictable to those paying attention. This isn't really just about Barron, and it's not really about Trump. It's about understanding a system that operates whether you participate in it or not. It's about recognizing that by the time something becomes obvious, the biggest gains have usually already been made. And it's about deciding that you're no longer going to sit back and watch those opportunities pass you by, without at least trying to understand them. Because while most people are busy reacting to the world, a smaller group is quietly preparing for what comes next. And over time, that difference in mindset becomes the difference between always being late and finally being early. If you found this video useful, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.